For centuries, the galaxy had been under the iron grip of the Tyranid Empire, a relentless force that stretched its influence across star systems. Its warlords had no mercy, their power was absolute, and their fleets vast. As the stars themselves, every world that fell under their shadow became a new prize to add to their empire. The Tyranids never stopped. They swept through space like a storm. No race was safe, no planet immune. Their soldiers were countless, and their hunger insatiable. They didn't simply conquer, they destroyed, leaving nothing but desolation in their wake. Entire civilizations had been wiped from existence, without a trace. Planets stripped of their resources, cities reduced to rubble. Those who survived were either enslaved or erased. Every attempt at rebellion was crushed with terrifying precision. The galaxy had been swallowed whole by the cold grip of tyranny, and as the centuries passed, hope grew dimmer and dimmer. The people of countless worlds had long since resigned themselves to the inevitable. Some began to believe that perhaps the Tyranids were destined to rule the stars forever, that the dream of freedom was nothing more than a fable, a distant memory from a time before the Empire's rise. It was the way of the universe, now the way of their lives. Nothing ever seemed to change, and with each passing day the thought of standing up against such a power seemed more and more impossible. The Tyranid warlords watched as the galaxy bent and knelt before them. Their dominance was complete, yet somewhere deep within the shadows, something began to stir, a spark, a whisper of something that had been long forgotten. Humans were not the first race to touch the stars, but they had long since disappeared from the galactic stage. Some believed they had been wiped out during one of the many conflicts that had preceded the rise of the Tyranid Empire. Others claimed they had simply faded away into myth and legend. Yet there were always those who refused to accept the idea that humanity had vanished for good, and so they waited, they built, they prepared. But none could have foreseen what would happen when the stars finally aligned, and the last remnant of humanity's might made its way across the void of space. When the flagship first appeared on the outer edges of the galaxy took notice. The Tyranid forces who had ruled for so long watched in stunned silence as a massive vessel unlike anything they had ever encountered emerged from the unknown. It was not like the other ships they had faced. It was a behemoth. Its size dwarfed anything they had ever seen. Its structure was strange, alien to their understanding, a marvel of technology that seemed to shimmer with untapped potential. As the flagship approached, the galaxy held its breath, and for the first time in an age the Tyranid warlords faltered. The endless war of conquest had met its first true challenge, and the universe watched with anticipation, wondering what would happen next. The legend had returned. Humanity was no longer a memory, it was a reality, and for the first time in centuries, there was a glimmer of hope that burned across the stars. The Tyranid Empire had always been a force to be reckoned with. Their ships and warriors were the very embodiment of power and destruction. The universe had trembled at the mere mention of their name. Entire fleets had been wiped out by their unrelenting tide of war, but now, for the first time in history, they found themselves faced with something they couldn't predict, something that made them hesitate. For the first time in centuries, the flagship of humanity was not like the enemies they had faced before. It wasn't simply a ship, it was a symbol of something more, something unknown to them. Its arrival sparked fear and curiosity in equal measure. The Tyranid warlords had thought they were invincible. Their fleets and armies were an unstoppable force. But humanity's flagship defied all logic. It didn't just fight with brute strength, it fought with precision and intelligence, a strategy that the Tyranids had never encountered before. The first clash between the two forces was unlike anything the galaxy had ever witnessed. The Tyranid fleet moved in waves, determined to crush the flagship and its newfound allies. But the humans aboard their vessel had something else in mind. They knew that their strength lay not in sheer force alone, but in the careful use of their technology. Their weapons were unlike any the Tyranids had faced. They unleashed energy blasts so intense that entire ships were torn apart. In seconds, the Tyranids tried to adapt, but the flagship was too fast, too efficient. It sliced through their fleet with ease, taking down flagship after flagship without hesitation. The Tyranid warlords were stunned. They had never seen such power before. Their forces were in disarray. They were losing ground faster than they could regroup. Their confidence was shaken. For the first time in history, they had met an enemy that didn't fear them. The humans aboard their flagship were not like the other races they had conquered. They were something different, something more dangerous. The warlords tried to push back, but the humans always seemed to be one step ahead. Their tactics were flawless. They understood their enemies and their own ship better than anyone could have imagined. The Tyranids began to feel the weight of their arrogance. The very thing that had allowed them to conquer so many worlds was now their greatest weakness. They had underestimated their foes, and now they were paying the price. But as the battles raged on, the Tyranid leadership started to realize something deeper was happening. This wasn't just a war of fleets. This was a war for control of the galaxy. The humans were not fighting for mere survival. They were fighting for something greater. They fought with a purpose, with a goal that went beyond just defeating their enemies. They fought for the future. They fought for freedom. And they fought with the knowledge that this was their last chance to reclaim what had been lost. The hope that had long since faded was now alive once more, and for the first time in many years, the Tyranid Empire began to question its own dominance. They had never faced an enemy with this kind of resolve, and they began to wonder if the galaxy had already shifted beyond their control. As the flagship of humanity carved its way through the Tyranid fleet, whispers began to spread across the galaxy. The stories of its might and the sudden resurgence of hope reached every corner of the universe. People who had long been slaves to the Tyranids dared to believe that change was possible. Entire populations began to stir in the quiet shadows of their planets, rising up to join this new force that had arrived to challenge their oppressors. The rallying cry of the flagship spread like wildfire across the stars. But even as the banners of resistance were raised, the Tyranid Empire scrambled to respond. Their warlords convened in secret chambers, hidden far from the prying eyes of their enemies. They had never faced anything like this before. The humans aboard their flagship fought with an intensity that could not be ignored. They used tactics that confounded the Tyranids. Their technology was far beyond what any had thought possible, and their leadership was unmatched. The Tyranid commanders, who had once led their forces with cold certainty, now found themselves grappling with uncertainty. The war had changed. They had been thrown off balance by a force they did not understand, and in their desperation they turned inward, seeking new strategies to overcome this new threat. They sent their deadliest warriors to the front lines, hoping to crush the humans before they could spread further. But it was no use. The flagship and its allies continued to push forward inch by inch, taking system after system. As the Tyranid fleet struggled to keep up, the humans were relentless. Their assaults, unyielding. Every victory they claimed felt like a piece of the galaxy was finally being freed from the dark clutches of the Tyranid Empire. Each world they liberated from the tyranny of the alien invaders began to glow once more with the light of life. The slaves of the Tyranids, once broken and beaten, began to fight alongside their liberators for the first time in generations. They stood as equals alongside the humans, and in the face of overwhelming odds they felt a strength they had not known in years. The Tyranids were no longer the unstoppable force they had once been. They were now being pushed back, retreating before an enemy they had never expected to face. Humanity's flagship had become more than just a vessel of war. It had become a symbol of defiance. It embodied the resistance of those who had been crushed beneath the boot of the Tyranid Empire, and it stood tall as a beacon of what was possible when hope and determination united. The sight of the flagship soaring through space filled the hearts of many with a fire that had long since been extinguished. It became the sign of a new era, a new chapter in the galaxy's history. And as the human forces began to expand their reach, more and more planets aligned with their cause. The fight was far from over, but with each victory the resistance grew stronger, and the Tyranid Empire felt its grip on the galaxy loosen slowly at first. But with each passing day the balance of power began to shift ever so slightly toward the humans and their allies. The war was no longer a hopeless struggle against an inevitable fate. It was now a battle for the future, a future where the people of the galaxy could stand free once more. And for the first time in a long time, the Tyranid Empire began to feel fear, something they had never truly known. The battles grew fiercer with each passing day as the flagship of humanity tore its way through the vast Tyranid fleets. The Tyranids had underestimated the strength of their enemies, and now they were faced with the terrifying reality that they might not be able to stop them. The warlords convened once more, their minds Filled with rage and frustration, the humans had managed to strike at the very heart of their empire, and the Tyranids had not been able to counter it. The sheer scale of the flagship's power was overwhelming, and the way its crews fought seemed almost instinctual. They adapted quickly, learning from each encounter, as if they were born for this war. The Tyranid forces had once been the most feared in the galaxy, but now they were retreating. They were on the defensive, their overwhelming numbers no longer enough to guarantee them victory. Their ships were falling one by one as the humans continued their relentless assault, and as the flagship moved deeper into Tyranid-controlled space, they began to see something they hadn't seen before. Unity. The scattered resistance groups that had formed in the wake of the humans' arrival had begun to coalesce into a true alliance. Planets that once cowered under the Tyranid heel now stood together, their combined forces working alongside humanity's flagship to strike at the heart of the Empire. The Tyranid warlords had no choice but to scramble their forces and attempt to stem the tide, but with each move they made, the humans seemed to be one step ahead. The tactics they used weren't just brute force, they relied on the cunning and resourcefulness that humanity had always been known for. Their strategies were unpredictable and lethal. They struck where the Tyranids least expected and hit with precision that shattered even the strongest Tyranid defenses. Each battle felt like a turning point, but even as the resistance grew stronger, the costs were mounting. The losses on both sides were devastating. Entire fleets were destroyed, entire worlds left in ruin, and for every victory the humans claimed, another piece of the galaxy was left in ashes. The Tyranid Empire was crumbling, but it was not going down without a fight. Their warlords fought with fury, desperate to reclaim the territories they had lost. But no matter how hard they pushed back, the flagship remained unyielding. The humans were determined to see this through. They fought not just for survival, but for the future of the galaxy, for those who had lived in fear for too long, for those who had lost everything under the Tyranid regime. The humans had promised them freedom, and now they would fight to give it to them. The war became not just a battle of ships and armies, but a battle of ideals. The Tyranids fought for dominance, for the continuation of their reign of terror, while humanity and its allies fought for something greater. They fought for a galaxy where the weak could rise up and stand beside the strong. They fought for the belief that freedom was worth any price. The flagship was not just a weapon of war, it was a symbol of that belief. And as the tide of battle began to shift, the Tyranid Empire found itself on the brink of collapse. The humans were on the verge of winning, but with each victory they knew they were also getting closer to a hard truth. The war would never truly end until the last remnants of the Tyranid Empire were eradicated, and so they pressed on relentlessly, hoping that the sacrifices made would lead to a lasting peace. For all the galaxy had suffered for too long, and the fight was far from over. As the conflict raged on, the human forces felt the weight of the war pressing down on them. The flagship, which had once been a shining beacon of hope, was now a symbol of the sacrifices that had been made. The cost of each victory was mounting, and the price was felt by everyone who fought alongside it. The galaxy had been forever changed by the arrival of humanity's flagship, and now the battle for the stars had turned into a bitter and endless struggle. The Tyranid warlords had not been defeated, but they were retreating further into their strongholds. Their once vast fleets were scattered and disorganized. The Tyranids had begun to adapt to the humans' tactics, but the humans were relentless in their pursuit. They never gave up, they never hesitated. Every assault was launched with precision and brutal efficiency. But even as their enemies began to crumble, humanity knew that they were not yet safe. The war was not over, and every victory only brought them closer to the next battle. The human forces had to hold their ground. They had to continue their assault if they were to push the Tyranids out of the galaxy once and for all. But the longer the war dragged on, the more the humans began to question the cost of their actions. Their ships were not invincible, and their crews were growing weary. The morale of the resistance groups that had once fought with unyielding hope began to fray as they saw their allies fall one by one. The battlefield was littered with the wreckage of warships and the shattered bodies of soldiers who had given everything to the cause. The Tyranids were relentless. They would not yield. They would fight until their last breath. And their enemies knew that they could never let their guard down for even a moment. Every victory came at a heavy price, and the aftermath of each battle was filled with destruction and sorrow. Even as the humans pushed forward, they found themselves confronting the harsh reality that the fight was not just for survival, but for the very soul of the galaxy. The Tyranids represented an insatiable hunger, a force that consumed everything in its path. And if humanity and its allies were to prevail, they would need more than just weapons or tactics. They would need unity. They would need something stronger than just military might. They would need the will to fight for a future that was not just their own, but for the countless worlds that had suffered under the Tyranid regime. The people who had long been oppressed and silenced could not be ignored any longer. The galaxy had long since forgotten what it meant to live free, but now they were standing on the edge of reclaiming that freedom, and the humans were determined to see it through to the end. The battles that followed were fierce and unforgiving. The humans had learned much from their early days of the war, and their enemies had grown desperate to survive. The flagship and its fleet were pushed to their limits, but with each clash they pressed forward, determined to reclaim the stars they had once lost. And with every victory they knew the Tyranid Empire was beginning to unravel. The end of the war was in sight, but the question that lingered in the minds of all who fought was whether the galaxy would ever truly be free, or if the scars of the war would remain for generations to come. The answer was uncertain, but humanity was not about to stop fighting, not now, not when victory was so close. As the war pressed on, the tyranny of the Tyranid Empire continued to waver, but not without a final and desperate effort to regain control. The once mighty warlords now found themselves struggling against a rising tide of resistance. The galaxy was no longer the cold and hopeless place it had been for so long. As the humans pressed forward, each system they liberated strengthened their resolve, but the journey ahead was far from simple. Their flagship had been their strength, their symbol of unity, but it had also become a target, a beacon for the Tyranids to strike at with everything they had left. The forces they threw at it were relentless. Their attacks grew more calculated, their strategies evolving as the warlords finally understood that simply overwhelming the humans with brute strength was no longer enough. They had to adapt or lose the battle for their very existence. Yet even as the Tyranids threw everything into their last attempted victory, they could not overcome the united front. Humanity had forged alliances with races from every corner of the galaxy, races once enslaved now fighting for their own freedom under the banner of a shared goal. Humanity's flagship had not just been a weapon of war, it had been a spark that ignited a flame of hope in the hearts of the oppressed. Their courage had fueled the fires of rebellion, and now together they had become a force that even the Tyranids could not easily crush. As the fleets of resistance grew ever larger, the Tyranids found their own numbers thin. Their once endless supply of warriors was stretched thin, and with every defeat they suffered, the cracks in their empire grew wider. Humanity's flagship became more than just a symbol. It became the sword that cut through the Tyranid hold on the galaxy. That the path to victory had its own dangers. As the humans pushed deeper into Tyranid's face, they found themselves confronting horrors they had never imagined. The deeper they ventured, the more they uncovered about the true nature of the Tyranid Empire's secrets that had been buried for centuries began to rise to the surface, and the humans realized that the war was not just for the galaxy's freedom, it was also for its very survival. The Tyranids had not been content with conquest alone. They had been playing a much larger game, a game that had been unfolding in the shadows, and the humans were only now beginning to understand the full scope of the danger they faced. The Empire's true power lay not just in their ships or their warriors, but in their very biology. The Tyranids were more than just invaders. They were parasites that consumed entire ecosystems and planets to further their own expansion. The humans had thought the Tyranids' reign was a war of dominance, but they now saw that it was also a war of survival. For the Tyranid race itself, the destruction they left behind was not just a byproduct of their hunger, it was a necessity for their continued existence. The horror of it all hit the humans like a storm. The reality of what they were up against became clearer than ever before. The war was no longer just about defeating a cruel empire. It was about stopping the spread of an invasive force that threatened every living thing in the galaxy. Humanity was fighting not just for the freedom of its people, but for the survival of the galaxy as a whole. And the weight of that responsibility pressed heavily on every person who fought aboard the flagship. The cost of the war had already been steep, but now the stakes were higher than ever, and there was no turning back. As the humans pressed onward through the heart of Tyranid space, they found themselves facing the darkest corners of the galaxy. The more they uncovered, the more they realized how deep the Tyranid infestation ran the Empire. Was not simply a conqueror, it was a living force, a vast organism that had spread its tendrils into every corner of existence, and as they fought to push it back, humanity began to understand that the war they were waging was not just a battle for freedom, it was a battle for the very fabric of life itself. The Tyranids were more than just invaders, they were a plague, a disease that consumed all in its path, and it was spreading faster than anyone could have anticipated. Every system they liberated revealed more of the nightmare that had been unleashed upon the galaxy. Entire ecosystems had been ravaged, and entire species had been wiped out without a trace. The human forces had thought they were fighting to liberate the oppressed, but what they were really doing was holding back the tide of extinction itself. With each victory, they realized that this war was not just about winning, it was about survival. The stakes were higher than anyone had ever imagined. But despite the growing weight of the conflict, humanity did not falter. They fought with every ounce of their strength. Their allies bolstered their ranks, and together they formed a united front against an enemy that seemed unstoppable. With every push forward, the humans knew they were getting closer to the heart of the Tyranid Empire, closer to the source of the infestation. But the deeper they went, the more they realized that their enemies were not just soldiers or ships, they were a living collective, an intelligence that could adapt and evolve with terrifying speed. It was no longer enough to fight with traditional methods. They had to rethink everything they knew about warfare. Humanity's flagship had been their greatest weapon, but it was also their greatest vulnerability. The Tyranids knew it had to be destroyed if they were to have any hope of stopping the humans, and so the flagship became the focal point of every Tyranid assault. Their forces threw everything they had at it, desperate to take it down. But the humans aboard the flagship were equally determined. They had seen too much to back down. Now they had sacrificed too much. They knew that they had come too far to turn back, and with each attack they repelled, the flagship remained unyielding. It was more than just a ship, it was a symbol of their hope, their determination, and their resolve. No matter how many times the Tyranid forces came at them, they held firm. They fought not just for their own future, but for the future of every race that had suffered under Tyranid rule. The galaxy had seen devastation, the likes of which no one had ever imagined. But now it was also seeing a glimpse of something else. It was seeing a force of resistance that refused to bow. It was seeing a fight for the future, where hope was not just a fleeting dream, but a tangible reality. As the battle raged on, the Tyranid warlords grew more desperate. The once unshakable empire began to crumble beneath the weight of humanity's defiance, and for the first time in the war, they realized that their victory was no longer assured. They had underestimated the humans, and now they were paying the price for their arrogance. The humans were no longer fighting to survive, they were fighting to win, and nothing would stop them from achieving it, no matter the cost. The final battle was upon them. Humanity had pushed through the Tyranid defenses, and now stood at the doorstep of the heart of the Empire. The Tyranids had been forced to retreat to their last bastions, but even in their desperation they fought with unrelenting fury. Their forces were scattered, their leaders in disarray, but their hunger for domination was as strong as ever. They could not afford to lose now. If they did, their empire would fall, and the very force that had once been so invincible would crumble into nothingness. The humans knew this was at the moment that would decide the fate of the galaxy. They had been through so much, so many battles, so many sacrifices, so many losses, but they could feel it. The end was near. They would either succeed in their mission or fall. Trying, the flagship stood as a beacon of all they had fought for, but its crew had seen the toll this war had taken on them. All they had endured, the pain, the loss, the endless nights of battle. They had been pushed beyond their limits, but they had not broken, and now they would face the Tyranid Empire one last time. To end it all, the Tyranid fleet assembled for what would be their final stand, a massive armada of ships that stretched across the stars. Their overwhelming numbers were still a threat, but they were no longer coordinated, no longer the unified force they had once been. The humans had shattered their morale and broken their lines. The Tyranids were fighting not to conquer, but to survive. but they could feel the end closing in. Humanity's forces had rallied, and now they were ready. The flagship and its allies moved into position, their weapons primed, their tactics flawless, as they prepared for the final confrontation. It would be a battle like no other. The Tyranids threw everything they had left at the humans, their ships attacking in waves, their warriors launching themselves into the fray with a ferocity born of desperation. But the humans were ready. They had learned from every battle, every confrontation, every mistake they had made along the way. And they were prepared for this moment. Every blow they struck carried the weight of everything they had fought for, and everything they had lost. With every ship that fell, with every enemy that was crushed, they moved closer to their final goal. And as the flagship's weapons unleashed their fury upon the heart of the Tyranid fleet, the humans knew this was the turning point. They could feel the balance of the war tipping in their favor, and with each passing moment, the Tyranid forces grew weaker, their grip on the galaxy slipping away. The final assault was intense. The flagship's massive guns tore through the Tyranid defenses, and their ships disintegrated into the void. The last remnants of the Tyranid fleet were wiped out, and as the dust settled, the humans stood victorious. The cost had been great, but the victory was undeniable. The Tyranid Empire had been defeated, and the galaxy was finally free from its grip. Humanity had done the impossible. They had defied the odds and defeated an empire that had seemed invincible. And as they looked out into the stars, they knew that the future was theirs to shape. The war had been long and brutal, but in the end, the humans had won. They had proved that hope could endure even in the face of overwhelming darkness. And with the Tyranids finally gone, the galaxy could begin to heal and rebuild what had been lost. And though the scars of the war would remain for generations to come, the legacy of humanity's flagship would live on as a reminder that even in the darkest times, hope could light the way.